My lovely audience, it is with deepest pride and greatest pleasure that we welcome you today. And now we invite you to relax. Let us pull up a chair as the interview proudly presents Jean Piaget.
This is Jean Piaget, put those children to the test. School of thought was cognitive, of course, and psychoanalysis.
Naturalistic observations, why he makes simple tests. Testing children for their logic, don't believe me, check his project.
He can teach, he can reason, after all, he's from Sweden, director of educational science. Go on and see him teaching at university.
We present Jean Piaget. This is Jean Piaget. Today we are here to talk about the life of world-renowned scientist Jean Piaget, who is best known for his child development studies and the theories of the 4 stages of childhood development. Jean Piaget's mother, Rebecca Jackson. So tell us about your son. What was he like as a child?
Well, he was always determined when he was growing up. As soon as he was born on August 9th, 1896, in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, I knew that my boy was destined for greatness. I remember him telling me that he wanted to help me. He was always so caring and wanted to help. You see, I had a condition. It wasn't terrible. I was just a tad mentally unstable during his childhood. He wanted to help me out so badly that this kind boy and his godfather actually helped him out and pursue his childhood. With his godfather's help, my Jean managed to do so much.
That sounds so kind of him. Was he a bright child growing up?
Why, yes, my Jean was a genius. In fact, when he was only 11, my Jean actually published a paper about the albino sparrow. And as he grew up, he graduated from Neuchâtel University and earned a doctoral for researching mollusks. My Jean was always the smart one in the family. You know, I had wanted my Jean to learn about religion and philosophy at first, but when I saw my baby so happy and excited for psychology, I just couldn't say no.
Wow. So was he all about studying, or did he eventually develop a family?
Oh yes, of course. In fact, Jean did love to study and work, but when he got sick from working and studying too hard, he took a year off, which I believe was a good thing for my baby. But he did have his own family, a wife, 2 daughters, and a son. But my dear Jean passed away on September 17th, 1980 in Geneva, Switzerland. Oh, my dear Jean was so much obsessed with his work, he actually brought his kids into that famous experiment he did. It was about his child psychology and logic.
Oh yes, that was his most famous work, known by all psychologists. Now we're joined by Jean Piaget's daughter, Lucienne Piaget. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much, Alyssa.
Great. So tell us, how was it being part of your father's psychological study?
It was rather interesting. He used a longitudinal study to see the 4 stages of child development.
And what were the 4 stages?
Well, the very first stage was called sensory motor stage, where children up till age 2 were studied to see how they acted. Piaget found out that children acquire knowledge through sensory experiences and manipulating objects.
And how was that measured?
Well, the operational definition my father used was to see if they understood the meaning of object permanence.
And what was object permanence?
Object permanence is when people have the ability to understand that objects continue to exist even if they aren't visible or audible. So my father experimented that after he introduced an object and then removed it from our field of sight, the kids who were looking for the object understood that the object still exists even if they couldn't see it. On the other hand, those who got sad and confused at the disappearance of the object he proposed did not comprehend the concept of object permanence. To further enhance his experiment, my father used a habituation procedure to gauge a subject's object permanence. So basically, the child will be repeatedly exposed to the same object, and my father would measure the amount of time the child will take to look for every trial to see if they understand the concept of object permanence. Use direct groping.
And what is directed groping?
It's a basic concept that children will experiment with objects solely to find out what happens.
Oh wow, so that's why children try to touch a hot stove simply to find out what happens? That's so interesting. And what were the other 3 steps?
Well, the second stage was called pre-operational stage. Jean Piaget found out during this stage that kids were really egocentric and had difficulty understanding life from any other perspective from anyone else but theirs. This idea was called animism, a type of thought where they believe that the world is created for them and they can control it. This then transfers into the idea that nature around them is alive and controllable to them during this time.
So basically we become narcissistic children during this stage?
Well, yes, if you put it that way. But the third stage is when we get better.
And what exactly does the third stage entail?
This third stage is basically composed of children being able to think more logically than before. The issue with this is that the thoughts they held were too rigid to be able to understand the abstract and hypothetical concepts.
Was that all that Piaget picked up during the pre-operational stage?
Well, no. There was a new concept that was called conservation. This is the idea that children, by this age, were able to determine that a certain quantity will remain the same despite the adjustment of the container, shape, or apparent size.
So the kids further derived from the general concept of object permanence into conservation?
Yes, exactly. And then during the final formal operational stage, my father theorized that the subjects have an increase in logic, ability to use deductive reasoning, and process and understanding of abstract ideas.
Wow, so this has finally come full circle?
Yes, my father devoted much of his life to it, and it has been held to be the truth by most scientists today.
Hello, Dr. Kim.
Why, thank you, Miss Kelly. So, I do hold some opposing views, but for a man of his time, Jean Piaget conducted a rather sophisticated and modern experiment.
What exactly do you have against Piaget's work?
Oh, I do not necessarily hold any grudges against the scientist. Simply that the experiment he conducted was of a too small a research sample, and on top of that, it was not a random sampling that could have been effectively generalized to fit subjects of all nationalities. You see, he specifically conducted an experiment on the offspring of well-educated professionals from a rather high socioeconomic status. This small sample group that was targeted solely on the children of those social groups caused a bad generalization on Piaget's part.
So is that the only flaw of Piaget's experiment?
No. Well, in current psychology fields, researchers are finding out that the theories Piaget made on animism is false. In fact, the children are less egocentric and possess some of the other concepts before the designated ages by Piaget.
Oh, I see. Were there any other criticisms from current researchers?
Yes. In fact, there was a complete lack of statistical analysis during his experiment. The entire study was subjective rather than it being objective, like all psychological studies should be. Also, Piaget was a biased researcher and underestimated subjects right away, causing the data to become even more skewed due to both the lack of the correlation and researcher bias.
Wow, you must really dislike Piaget.
No, I do not hate the researcher. I simply believe the experiment to have been too skewed to be of any current use.
Well, what of Piaget did you enjoy?
I respect the psychologist as well as the field he was in. The rather young branch of psychology known as cognitive psychology was his area of expertise.
And what was the field known for?
Cognitive psychology is the branch of psychology that studies mental processes including how people think, perceive, remember, and learn. It fits Jean Piaget's study of children since this field's core focus is on how people acquire, process, and store information. And this field was more accurate in its experiment for it used scientific research methods to study the mental process. This field is more current and more accurate than, in my opinion, any other field of psychology.